Everyone. Welcome. Today we're going to talk about the problems with elections and with representative democracy. We're going to try to take a look at this from a libertarian, anti-authoritarian, anarchist point of view. And of course, some people who have asked me to talk on different topics don't really have a lot of background in these issues. So at a certain point, we're going to keep this very basic to look at the basic issues for anarchists. But a little further on, we are going to get into some more subtle, nuanced, and perhaps more difficult issues for people to consider. My name is Laura Kai. This is Anarchist Analysis, and welcome everybody. Okay. As the whole world knows, we've recently had an election in the United States, which was very close indeed, um, as far as elections go. And because of the recent situation in the United States with an absolutely abysmal president, Donald Trump, right? Um, who's a racist, a sexist, just completely horrible. Of course, people who were in opposition to his type of politics were often very engaged in calling for people to go out to vote, as they call it, to vote him out. From an anarchist point of view, was that necessary? Or wasn't it? We're going to talk about that a little bit later. First, I'd like to talk about, in general, what anarchists want to do and how the traditional way of electing representatives basically stands in contrast to what we really want to achieve. Now, what we want to achieve is a horizontal, flat society where people are equal on an equal basis, where people can take part in decision making on an equal basis. And how is that different than what we have with representative democracy? Now, some people might say, but wait a second, I have the right to vote, so I'm making a decision. Well, not really, not really. You are making a decision, right? You're making a decision to give away your decision making power. That's basically what voting is. Because the system of being governed works in the following way. You elect a representative, and then further, that representative does what that representative does, and you don't necessarily have anything to say about it. Of course, theoretically, people can say, well, you could wait some years and vote them out if they don't do what you want. Sure, but in the meantime, real decisions get made that, first of all, can be very different than what was promised. Second of all, they can be completely against what your values are. You have no way really to influence it if we are dealing with a system of representative democracy. Okay, the people do not get to choose and get to vote and voice their issues on particular issues that occur during everyday functioning of the government or a municipality. And this is a problem on many, many levels. First of all, it's a problem that people do not get a chance to decide things. And this is a fundamental problem if you talk about democracy. People do not get to decide things or necessarily even follow what's happening and what's being decided. Because in reality, once people give their vote, most of the time they don't really follow a lot of the issues that are going on day to day. They just find out later, oh, something was done, something was changed. Even sometimes something that has very serious consequences for all our lives. So, what kind of society we would like to create in the future and what we should be working for is a society where, first of all, people have more direct control over all the decisions that affect their lives. But secondly, that the society has as its goal the creation and maintenance of an egalitarian society where people are equal, where people have equal access to resources, where people can enjoy the fruits of their labor. And this is a very important distinction, actually, between those who just advocate for more direct democracy and what we're actually advocating for. Let me give you an example. Um, there were some thinkers who at sometimes were involved in our tendency, sometimes not, who advocated for a type of municipal libertarianism or something like this. And the idea of this was very much based on advocating for people taking more responsibility for decisions, having more direct democracy at a local level. Likewise, there were movements for participatory budgets where um, people would be given a actually small, actually perhaps insignificant amount of a municipal budget to play with and to decide about. And people who advocated very strongly for that said that this was democracy in action. I'd like to argue that without having a very clear goal of creating an egalitarian society, democracy itself, I wouldn't say it's worthless, but it's not all it's cracked up to be. Case in point, case in point. Um, we can have a decision about anything going on that is either informed by people's intentions to create that type of egalitarian society based on ideas of social equality, or we can have decisions which are made which are based on bourgeois values, which internalize hierarchy and social injustice in many ways. Recently, in my neighborhood, we had a situation where local politicians wanted to discuss having a place for homeless people to stay in the local hospital. And some concerned citizens uh, got really upset because they don't want to see homeless people in the neighborhood. They were arguing like, oh, well, the neighborhood is changing. It's gentrifying. Uh, we're doing such good work to change the neighborhood, and you want to put homeless people here. Well, luckily, this topic didn't really get discussed so much in the public. I was a little concerned. I was a little concerned that the voice of those people might get quite loud. And in a pseudo-democratic process, and I say pseudo-democratic here because um, not all of the people in society would be consulted on this, but only a minority of rather vocal people would actually have an influence on that decision. I was concerned that the people who have this type of value, like oh, poor people, homeless people, get them away from me, might prevail in a pseudo-democratic debate. And this is a quite unfortunate situation about democracy right now, is that democracy is only as good as, the intentions of the people who are participating in it. And so when we talk about the society that we want to create, yes, it is democratic, but it has to have a very strong foundation on our egalitarian principles. Democracy by itself, voting by itself, giving the right to sort of universal decision making is something that we want to achieve, but creating the society that we have to achieve is going to be the result of very long-term work on building social consciousness. Okay, so this is a little bit about the background of what kind of society we'd like to create. And throughout the history of the anarchist ideas, um, there have been many discussions about whether or not we can achieve the type of change we'd like to create by taking part in elections, either by giving our voice and voting, or more problematically, by taking part in elections by trying to become an elected representative and participate in the political system. Now, that particular question has had a lot of historical significance, I would say, in terms of the world's social movement. We can go back to some time ago when we had an organization called the First International. And the First International meant to advance socialist workers' struggle. And very, very quickly, the First International became quite split in terms, and eventually did split. And uh, really, um, the role of representative democracy, the role of the political party, et cetera, did split people very much, um, and really defines the fact that there's not one kind of socialism. Okay, at those in those days, people used the word socialist a lot more than they used the word anarchist. So, of course, one faction of the International was in fact anarchists, yes, but they often use the word socialist. But they saw themselves as opponents of a strategy of trying to effect change by getting into political power. Okay, a name that's very often associated with this tendency would be Bakunin, and a name which is very much associated with the other tendency would be Marx. Okay, for those of you who maybe don't know what I'm talking about or have a background, maybe you've heard these names. Okay, and basically, Marx and his advocates very much saw that um, you need to somehow get into a position to capture the state in order to create revolutionary change. Okay. They had some crazy idea that eventually the state will wither away, which has been proven to be untrue. The state does not wither away. This is not the nature of the beast, we can say. Um, but this was their idea that, yes, we can have revolutionary change through executing and coming into political power. And proponents of this maybe way of thinking very often advocated for forming political parties, trying to get into power in different ways, including through the electoral farce. Okay, and Bakunin and his advocates would more or less say that, well, once a worker puts themselves in that position of coming into power, when they are in a bourgeois system, that they themselves will start to work as statesmen, as representatives of the bourgeois order, and cease to be representatives of the workers. Now, in uh, amongst anarchists and amongst people on the left, until this day, there's actually quite a lot of disagreement about the extent to which this is true. To me, this is a little surprising because if you look historically at it, you see very much that the anarchists were quite right about what tends to happen when people get into political power. Okay, this is a constant process then of making compromises with positions in the name of being realistic, in the name of uh, creating gradual change, also with the excuse of, I can't do anything. And the overwhelming evidence really is that this type of strategy isn't very effective. It doesn't take, a rocket scientist to really go through all of the different examples in history of this happening and saying, well, there's a little something off with this idea. Yet, every single time, I still notice that in the left, when elections come up, there are always discussions about moving the state, moving the government, moving it to the left. Okay, always. And, you know, if they manage to elect some people, I wouldn't say that it's 100% a waste of time sometimes. Sometimes the left can have some small influence on particular issues. But any expectation that the left can act as a revolutionary force within the existing bourgeois capitalist um, state system is really very much of an illusion because, first of all, the system is set up to protect itself, to self perpetuate itself. And if it did perceive this as a real threat, um, it wouldn't be allowed to happen. Rather, where there are small victories for such people, it rather tends to occur that people who are maybe a little bit left progressive are co-opted into the system further. They're seen as sort of an, an opposition inside the system that acts as a ventilation, like a vent for social frustration, and trying to get people rather than protesting on the street, rather than acting in a militant way, um, finding a way to channel popular discontent, popular militancy into an electoral form, into this form of participating in the discourse. And this has been noted again and again by critics, people who are either more radical leftist or anarchists, note again and again that where people have believed that they are moving something a little to the left or a little in a more progressive way, actually, sometimes what they were doing was actually de-radicalizing their own demands, de-radicalizing their own movements. So if we come back to a situation like which occurred recently in the United States, a lot of people I know um, were, rightfully so, quite appalled by the situation of created with Mr. Trump in power. I mean, what Mr. Trump would say, absolutely, totally unacceptable. Okay, in a more radical social climate, um, he might have been gotten rid of. And unfortunately, in the United States, it's not that way. Um, so rather, efforts focus on getting him out. And getting him out in the United States always revolves around the strategy of, well, for the lesser of two evils. Now, quite unfortunately, the lesser of two evils is always evil. Okay. And in this situation where you have established, powerful political parties which are funded by big capital, which are interested in maintaining the military industrial complex, uh, these parties don't offer a great alternative to anything else. Uh, as a matter of fact, they're just another part of the stinking system. Of course, on specific issues, there can be a difference. And some people get very wound up about particular issues. Rightfully so. Rightfully so. If you have a racist as a president, of course, if you are appalled by racism, you will get very upset about that. But the bigger question is this something that as anarchists we really benefit from? Is this something that just distracts us? I would argue rather the latter. And the reason because of this is that nothing is going to change unless we really get started being proponents for our own ideas. And being proponents for our own ideas doesn't mean going on the internet and putting our opinions once in a while. It doesn't mean uh, going to a big, like, anti-Trump demonstration, although I'm not against that, of course. But it doesn't mean going as one of the crowd and just saying, yeah, Trump is bad, Trump is bad. It's not enough. It does mean building long-term organizations. It does mean having to do a lot of grassroots work in the community. And it does mean upping the ante and increasing your scale of participation and activity in this type of activity. And anarchists need to get on the ball to do this because nobody is going to do it for us. Nobody. We have to do it. So for me, it's a bit of a waste of time and energy to get crazy about, yeah, I need to go vote, this and that. Probably, and arguably, there are different opinions about it. Probably if you went out and voted, okay, what difference does it make? You're still not going to affect what, for example, Mr. Biden is going to do. And he's going to do a lot of shit. just like Mr. Obama. They're going to bomb people. They're going to send drones, kill children. Um, it's not what you want, I'm sure. Not what you want. That's what you voted for, though. And that's what happens when you give up your decision making power to a representative. That person is not responsible to you. It's not easy to recall them, practically impossible to recall them, etc., etc. So, in my opinion, we should really be focusing on something else. And definitely, we should never fall into this way of thinking that one of the lesser of two evils is substantially better than the other. Okay. This is usually a myth, and this is usually not the case. This is sometimes this type of bipartisan thinking that gets shoved onto the public conscious by different social factors, by the media, so on and so forth. Certainly in our country, we could see such things going on now where, mm, of course, we also have terrible government uh, that does horrible things. The sort of alternative to it, the last government, also did horrible things. But sometimes they did horrible things without any echo of discontent. And how can that be? Well, that could be because people sometimes are mobilized by issues, certain issues that are more understandable for them than other issues which seem more complex. So, for example, if you know the older government put in a lot of neoliberal policies that actually have drastic negative effects on all of the society, there was a lot less opposition to them than there would be about changing a, a judge on the Constitutional Tribunal, which actually is absurd because, you know, this is something that deeply affects everybody's lives and livelihood. Yet it is something that people don't necessarily understand because they haven't really had the tools to make a deeper analysis of the workings of capitalism and of neoliberal capitalist capitalism. So, therefore, we could see situations such as today in Poland, where we have opponents of the present government uh, more or less lobbying for people who are, um, let's just say, enemies of the working class. Not that this government isn't also, of course they are. Um, but, you know, people who are absolutely not acceptable from our point of view because they are going to basically, throw millions of people into further misery. There cannot be an alternative to what we have now. They could be people who slightly liberalize this or that slightly. They're not going to make any big difference in that area. And so this is the conundrum, the situation that we find ourselves in reality, is that a lot of people are worked up. I will not call them ever minor issues. I will never call an issue like racism or abortion a minor issue. No way. Although there are some people who might see that on the overall scale as a minor issue. No, they're not minor issues. But there are people who very much get worked up about certain issues that are more understandable for them and let other issues, which are enormous, go by. Okay. And this is a very huge problem. So, just to summarize, when you see a situation like that, it's somewhat an illusion to think that your individual vote is going to make a big difference in terms of the overall system of misery that we live in. No, it's not. The overall system of misery that we live in is only going to be resolved or got rid of by mass popular action, which is very conscious of what it wants to get rid of and what it wants to put in its place. And in order to build that, we have to be focusing our energy and our militancy in that direction. Probably nothing wrong happens if you voted. You're silly, but nothing wrong happens. But, you know, I am amongst this group of people who would be quite critical of anybody who says that they are in the tradition of anarchism, that they would like to create this type of society, but then in reality says, well, listen, we have to vote. We have to get this person out. We have to vote. It's an illusion. Much worse than that is if anybody wants to be in a representative position and thinks that they're going to be good and they're going to do good and they're going to affect the change that we want to affect by getting in a representative position. Now, quite unfortunately, and I've talked to my friends about it many times, quite unfortunately, quite a number of people I know became politicians, including people who used to be anarchists and waving their black flags, and they became politicians. And oh, it's really sad. But what happens with these people? Do they do good things? No, they get eaten up by the system. It's very much an illusion that as an individual, you're going to go somewhere into a political system full of sharks and you're going to create the type of social change that you think is needed. Of course, those people, they don't learn from this. What they basically argue is, yeah, of course, if I'm alone, I'm not going to be able to do it. You have to elect more of us. Yeah. So it's really hard to argue with that type of logic because once people start using that type of logic, they won't even look at the empirical facts that you can see that people time after time who have gone into power, um, even when there are more of them, tend to shift their politics rather than shifting politics in another direction. And there is no lack of less progressive green parties around the world who have gotten into power. And every time people can tell stories about them, about some of the things that they did first. People who got into power, then they're trying to break a strike, or they got into power and then, oh yeah, they're in favor of raising rents and evicting people. You know, people from Europe know who I'm talking about when I talk about those people. The Green Party from Germany, right? The Social Democrats. Um, these people, completely, their politics got skewed by this perception of having to deal with real politics like grown-ups. Real politics like grown-ups. What does that mean? We have to be more realistic within the capitalist society. Yeah, that's what they think. Okay, and that's how the capitalist society changes them and changes them into being just, a different color of ruler, a different um, a different color of executor of capitalist society on us. Okay, so forget about it. Guys, I said I would talk a little bit about union elections as well. And the reason I'm going to talk about it is because sometimes people ask about it. And a friend of mine who's interested in anarcho-syndicalism, rather new to it, said, "Oh, I saw some discussion about union elections on the internet, and it seems that people more or less think it's okay. What's your opinion about it?" Okay, here we'll go. Um, Guys, it's not an easy black and white topic to talk about, partially because the reality of what a union election is in different countries and what it entitles people to do is very different. Okay, so as a starting point, um, what are we talking about when we talk about union elections? Are we talking about electing a person who is going to represent a part of the workforce to the boss in negotiations? Or are we talking about somebody who is going to sit on the management board of the company? Because in Poland or other countries, there are things like this. Are we talking about um, unions which are then going to be subsidized by the state? What are we talking about? Okay, coming back to the topic, um, well, we never got off the topic, but coming back to the basic issue. The basic issue is that if we create unions, okay, we're not creating unions for the same reason as other people. Okay, this is an important thing. A lot of people create unions for the reason of, the perception that within the capitalist society, they are going to make some gains for the working class. Okay, better wages within the capitalist society even, of course, are better. Like everybody logically would say, yes, of course I want better wages. Um, the problem is that this is not the only issue for workers to think about. We as anarcho-syndicalists always have a final goal. We have a finalist goal in the back of our heads all the time. And we are always thinking of what kind of structures we build that can help us prepare people for um, functioning in a way that's going to prepare them for self-managed society. Okay, and it's rather obvious that we have to take our core values very seriously. Our core values are going to be like this, that the democracy has to be horizontal. We don't have a decision maker over us. If we have anybody representing us, representation should be minimal and only in necessary situations. If it's not really necessary to be represented, why would we do it? And if anybody is chosen to speak on our behalf or do something on our behalf, they have to be mandated, they have to be guided by clear instructions, and they have to be recallable if they are not um, following the specific instructions of the people they're representing. And this is a very basic idea. Now, guys, you would be very surprised that sometimes people who have no background in libertarian thought, they understand this perfectly in real life situations. And sometimes people who have background in political thought don't understand this. I can give you a concrete example of how representation can look um, in the most basic of situations, going and negotiating with the bosses. Um, I was present one time, we had a union, and this union was a union of cleaners and meal servers, and there were two technical maintenance workers as well in the union in a hospital in the city of Bełchatów in Poland. And they had a strike, um, wildcat actually, down there. And myself and my another friend of mine from the ZSP, my union, we went down there to support them, basically. Also, maybe to give them some tips because they hadn't really done that before. And what happened at a certain point, it came to, there were quite a number of people striking, and it came to a point where, the boss showed up and had to negotiate with people. And so we got a big room. Everybody went in to talk to the boss. And that's the way we prefer to do it. Everybody goes in and talks to the boss. And we've done it quite a number of times where everybody involved can be in the negotiations. But it does happen that sometimes, for example, the boss says, no, I'm not going to talk to you unless you get just like two or three of you to come in and be the representatives. Then I'll talk to you. That does happen. And you could sort of like push, no, 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 no. And if you have enough power, you could probably win that. In this particular situation, um, we sent in three people to talk to the boss. I was one of them, even though I didn't work there. But I sort of, the boss like insisted that I be one of them and go in. So I went in. But what was really good about this situation is that the women, like all the workers, were in the corridor waiting. The women were inside. And every time the boss proposed something, they said, wait a minute. And they went out in the corridor and they talked to everybody. And they said, the boss is saying this. What should I say? And going back, workers say this. Okay, the boss says something else. They go out. And in my opinion, that was a very good way of dealing with the situation because, in fact, these people who were acting in a representative role at that moment, because they were speaking on behalf of other people, were really not speaking on behalf of them. They were consulting all the decisions and all the proposals. And they did this rather intuitively because, they just didn't want to, they intuitively knew that to be trusted by their coworkers, they should do this and they shouldn't make any concessions, agreements, or anything without talking to them. And it seems really natural. But although it seems very natural, quite unfortunately, this is the legacy of union representatives tends to be making other agreements that workers never even discussed or heard of. Okay? This is what happens in hierarchical unions all the time in representative unions. And unfortunately, it also does happen in unions that see itself themselves or present themselves as alternatives to mainstream unionism, like they're alternative unions, and they do this also. So when we talk about electing people, electing, this is a big word. Are we talking about electing people for a particular function, which is then not really controlled on a day-to-day basis? Or are we electing people, meaning choosing them to fulfill a function is controlled very much by the membership on a regular basis, and which is truly accountable to the membership? Well, for me, these are completely different things. Completely different things. Okay? Furthermore, when we're talking about union elections, like I said, union elections in different places may be related to different powers given to the elected officials. Um, and this is what the big question is about. Now, the question is really quite hot, I would say, amongst people who call themselves syndicalists. Okay. I am among the people who feel that there's an anarcho-syndicalism and a syndicalism without anarcho. And in addition, there's some gray area of people who maybe call themselves that or allude to that tradition in some way, but rather in practice are a little bit fuzzy in some areas, especially concerning this. Let me give you some concrete examples. Um, as some people who are maybe more deep into the subject maybe know, um, for example, in Spain, we had a number of divisions amongst unions that used to be together. One division occurred in the 1970s between an organization which became the CNT-AIT and that one that later became known as the CGT. And one of the things that they thought, probably the main thing that divided them, was a position on participating in union elections. And this is very much concretely because of the anarchist idea, but also, the very fact that participation in these elections brought people representative roles. They brought unions state subsidies, which they felt very much rather mitigated the radicalism of these organizations. And I tend to think that this is correct because, as I can see, organizations that are dependent on the state, or in the case of Poland, you know, the employer, because there are unions that receive money or are financed effectively by the workplace. Um, these organizations, if their goal is to keep a representative role and maintain power in a representative role, they have a vested interest now in not having conflict with the state, with not having conflict with the employer. Okay, so the CNT, AIT, and the CGT were organizations that were split from the original CNT in the 70s after Francoism In Spain, that organization, the CNT, split numerous times in history over various practical issues, and that was one of them. In more recent years, they're also split between the CNT and CIT-AIT. CNT-AIT maintains a classical anarchist character, anarcho-syndicalist character, in terms of their ideas, their final goals. That doesn't mean that everybody who joins it has to be an anarcho-syndicalist, but the purpose of the organization is to create forms of organization in the workplace and outside the workplace, which basically work as this way of practicing for creating a future self-managed society. In Poland, we have different forms of workers' representation and elections. And, I was always very critical of them. And you can see over and over again that the people who participate in these have a lot of interest in de-radicalizing the workers' actual struggle, or at least uh, keeping it manageable, managing the workers so they don't get out of hand. Um, there might be some exceptions, but even those who have been so-called more radical sometimes have gone into this trap of trying to get a representative function. Some years ago, I used to be in a different union here, and one of the many reasons that I left it was exactly like this. And what exactly was the story? I'll tell you. Um, it was not legalized, this union. It didn't have a legal form. But at a certain point, somebody who was a unionist, who had been the workers' elected representative in the management board in the past, that was his function. He lost support of his mainstream union for being a candidate for the next election. So he had an interest to legalize our union without any decision of the Congress. The Congress decision was against it, but he legalized our union. His name was Marshall Shari, just in case you hear any um, mythology about him. This is what happened. They legalized the union with him as, um, you know, the chairperson of the union. Nobody elected him, but well, maybe a small couloir of people elected him, but certainly not the membership, uh, that had a lot of decision-making functions. And the reason that this had to be done is because he wanted to be um, a candidate again for being representative of the workers on the management board of the company. And, he was elected, and that was his role. And you hear quite a lot of mythology about it later that, oh, there was a union there, blah, 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 and it was radical. And, well, I don't think so. I think very much there was a vertical um, establishment there. And being a workers' representative on a management board, in my opinion, this is unacceptable. Why? Because the workers' representative on a management board, this is a class collaborationist position that was put in place by social democracy in order to create, to achieve a certain goal. It is not coincidental that these people who fulfill that function, are entitled to profit sharing as members of the board. So please look how it works. If you are a workers' representative on a management board, if the company has better financial performance, you benefit financially. Okay? So, what are your interests going to be? Are your interests going to be that workers have more money, but that might affect the financial performance? Or do you have another interest? Now, people who supported that, and surprisingly, many people supported that as a way to create change from above. Um, People who supported that type of action, they would argue that, oh yes, but there's no proof that this person didn't fight in the interest of the worker. This person did fight in the interest of the worker. It's a little beyond the point. The point is, if we're going to call ourselves anarchists, anarcho-syndicalists, our main focus in creating unions should be to create horizontal ones where the rank and file militancy are encouraged to make decisions themselves, to use action as a way of speaking to the bosses, and not, just electing a representative and, yeah, that guy's going to go talk to the bosses and defend our interests. No. Okay. So when we talk about union elections, as I said, elections are very different in their nature depending on what the actual function of the person being elected is. And people, when they talk about this topic, sometimes they talk about shop stewards, and this is a particularly Anglo-centric um, way of looking at it. But okay, they have their reality and they refer to that type of reality. And one of the reasons they refer to it quite often is because many people, traditionally, people who have been militant in left movements, have tried to be in some sort of position of influence inside unions. And there's a long tradition of that in many countries. Okay, this is particularly certain socialist organizations have a long tradition of working within unions to try to change them, to try to move them, to try to radicalize them. Um, I would argue that they tended not to be successful, although people can also look at histories and point out some counterexamples. But I would argue that more often than not, they put themselves in roles which were not enviable, uh, roles of having to work with inside the capitalist framework, roles of um, basically organizing, managing the workers and managing the workers' struggle instead of promoting a more self-managed struggle. So for all of these reasons, I tend to think that, again, we shouldn't really be participating in any type of union election, with the exception of having some representatives from time to time where necessary, that where necessary, if they're not necessary, don't have them. These are people who need to rotate in their position so that they don't become entrenched in power, so that different people gain skills and different people are the representative, not just one person who becomes a de facto leader of a movement. These type of people, of course, people can choose as the representative. Okay, so the very term union election is not very descriptive about what's happening. The real question is what powers, what decision making powers are we giving to people when we elect them? And what does it do for the creation of a horizontal radical union movement? Does it hinder it? Does it make the creation of that type of movement more difficult? Or does it encourage it? Okay, these are the questions, not a simple question like, is voting in union elections bad? No, the question is a little deeper than that. Okay, and people, I promised myself that I wouldn't ramble on as much as I did last time. Uh, Guys, I will try to get some different people on, not just me as the talking head, but I do thank you for coming and listening to some of these considerations. I am going to put on some articles on this site related to this topic. There are a lot of good ones related to the topic of voting, and I'm going to put them up later today or tomorrow. And also feel free to put in your comments links to articles which you think, articles or discussions, other resources which you think are interesting. Okay, thank you very much. Bye.